Welcome to the Monday, December 8th edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Joe Bartel. You can follow me on Twitter, JB Fantasy Sports. As always, my co-host, Jake Letarski. You can follow him at RotoJake. We're going over the week 14, well, I guess week 15 here, start of the fantasy playoffs, the wave where guys go ahead and prioritize. And hopefully you are unlike me and have made in the fantasy playoffs in a bunch of leagues. Unfortunately, Jake, I would imagine that a lot of these players right now won't make a significant difference. And we actually got added on a list to a few of these players that we discussed last week were a bit of a blocking mechanism for people in fantasy right now. So going over the week.
Well, hopefully you've been listening to us all year and have a bye week locked up and don't have to worry about it. But there are some names that it's going to be very scenario based this week, but there are definitely some names that are worth keeping on the roster.
All right, so let's get right into the top 5 list. And I think it's pretty universal among the guys that need to be acquired at running back. It's either Jaylen Wright or Blake Corum. Last week we discussed Blake Corum. Nobody evidently listened to us because he's still at 33% roster. I couldn't believe that. I actually had to go check myself because you're that on the document. I'm like, okay, Jake's wrong. He was the obvious pickup last week. There's no way that he's not rostered higher. But lo and behold, both Blake Corum and Jaylen Wright to a lesser extent, but Blake Corum is still widely available, which is just ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I mean, our whole point last week was that there's standalone value even with Kyren Williams healthy, and we saw the ultimate standalone value here in Sunday's game. I mean, the snap count still heavily favors Kyren, and sure, you could say it was a blowout here, but 12 carries for 128 yards and 2 scores on 22 snaps. It's still only a 31% snap share, and he even caught a pass. So, our point was standalone value, maybe 6 to 8 points a game without Kyren Williams around, or with Kyren Williams around. But obviously you have Mr. Standalone value here. There's a ceiling that's now established here. And if there is ever a situation in which Kyren is limited, injured, or rests, Blake Corum's a league winner. So Blake Corum, I'm surprised. I was shocked as you. I wasn't even going to include him. And then I was like, whoa, still 33%. That's going to change with people being reactive to this week. And it may not necessarily be an auto start depending on your situation, but he's someone I definitely want to have on the roster here. And he kind of goes as 1A and 1B with our Dolphins, man, from this Miami backfield.
I had assumed Ollie Gordon, we were having this conversation last week. I mentioned Ray Davis as a pickup if you're trying to weaponize your bench, and the idea that if somebody gets injured, here is the obvious starter. I thought Ollie Gordon was that for the Dolphins. He nearly made my article update later in the week. I just didn't have a lot of faith in the Dolphins offense as a whole if HM was out. Well, lo and behold, that was put to the test last Sunday. Dolphins end up annihilating the Jets. Couldn't have been more wrong about that. Sorry if you used Tyrod Taylor like I did in a few critical leagues. You are now out of the playoffs as a result due to injury, which has been my entire fantasy season. But it was not Ollie Gordon that was the backup in the case HN got hurt. It was Jaylen Wright. And then, Jake, we got the dreaded, well, he could have come back into the game if the game was more competitive announcement from Mike McDaniel and Devon Achane. So if you're relying on Achane, I think Jaylen Wright is an obvious pickup and spend all your fab on. But realistically, we're probably not going to find an answer until Thursday about what this Dolphins backfield is going to look like, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. My main takeaway is that, with Achane out, Ollie Gordon's role didn't change. He got 5 carries, which is maybe on the high end, but, roughly around what he's been getting with healthy Achane, and snuck in a touchdown, so he has been used in goal line situations before. He's vultured some Achane touchdowns. Not super common, but it does happen. Essentially, his role didn't change at all. And it was Jaylen Wright that stepped into the RB1 role. He carried the ball 24 times for 107 yards and a score. Snap-wise, he was I actually didn't write that down, but he was definitely well ahead of Ollie Gordon. So, we have a new evaluation here of this backfield. But like you said, it's really tough doing this show on Monday. Devon Achane has a ribs injury. Apparently, it's not a fracture. He exited the game. Of course, he didn't return. It was a 34-10 blowout over the Jets. Apparently, he could have returned if needed, like you said. That's a real big wrench in the situation here. But in any case, Jaylen Wright is worth rostering. He bumps way high up the waiver list. We see what is possible that he can do if given the keys here. You've always been a little bit bearish on Achane being unable to handle a full workload. We at least have a compliment here. And remember, Jaylen Wright missed the first 6 games of the season on IR. He might have some fresh legs too. So this is a very interesting situation. And the other thing that when I was trying to rank these guys, I compared the playoff schedule of Jaylen Wright versus Blake Corum. Blake Corum's got the Lions up next, or actually number 1 against running backs, then at Seattle, 7, and then at Atlanta, who's 20. Whereas Jaylen Wright and the Dolphins, they've got a relatively tough matchup at Pittsburgh this year. They're a top 10 defense against opposing backs. But then for the semis and the championships, they're home against Cincinnati, home against Tampa Bay, who are 31 and 22 respectively. So again, I don't expect the H-N issue to keep surfacing in the semis and the finals, but in any case, like Jaylen Wright falls right up there in that same handcuff discussion. In a way, Jaylen Wright feels very similar to our Corum discussion last week. Do you pick up and start him confidently if the RB1 is there? Maybe not. Can you count on maybe 5-6 points or something along these lines? If there's and then having some ceiling, if there's an H-hand re-injury or that type of situation, we'll see. But those are definitely a couple of players worth rostering in the running back sector here. I've got, when we get to this position by position, I've got about 4 or 5 more running back names that are worth a look, but it's very clear that Jaylen Wright and Blake Corum are atop of that tier.
I'll throw you one more, and this won't make my waiver article today. It'll probably be an update either Tuesday or Wednesday. But reminder, we discussed this guy last week, Devin Singletary, in the event that we didn't actually, because this was recorded before the Monday injury to Tyrone Tracy happened in that loss to the Patriots. If Tracy is out, Devin Singletary becomes probably in flex or must-play territory, but we don't know the stats, and we also heard that Tracy theoretically could return this week, Giants off a bye. So we'll get to the Devin Singletary part of things in a little bit. It's not completely dire if you're missing out on Blake Corum and Jaylen Wright, and you do need a running back, but I do think Devin Singletary, if we got any more information about the Giants backfield after this bye week, would also be in that mix.
And it's worth mentioning that Singletary, while he didn't quite make my top 5 because of this Tracy uncertainty, he's had double-digit PPR points in 3 of his last 4 weeks. Before the bye, scored 19.2 PPR points against New England, who was number 2 against opposing backs in PPR formats, and of course probably got dropped quite a bit during the bye. So there was there's some extra availability there. Comes off the bye and gets the Commanders, who are 26. And then the Vikings, who are quite a bit better, and then the Raiders in championship week. So I guess if you want to talk standalone value, there's some here as well.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I normally try to put your feet to the fire a little bit more because the guys that we recommend, and it has been for basically this whole season, are largely not available in deeper leagues. Like I try to give some sort of long shot guy, or at least I try to argue that this podcast is meant for every league. But in reality, where we're at right now in the fantasy season, entering for a lot of people the first week of the fantasy postseason, if the Blake Corums and I would call this next guy Jayden Reed, for example, are already picked up, that would have been assumed maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago in a lot of these top end leagues. So just a reminder, Jayden Reed was on injured reserve a couple weeks ago, was officially activated for this Bears game, gets 6 touches. I thought, I was at this game, Jake, I thought he looked pretty good and really made that Packers offense more dynamic on a play-by-play basis too.
Yeah, I put Jayden Reed at number 4. There's one fellow 40% rostered player that is right up there that I gave a slight bump to. But yeah, the main takeaway for me was this is really the first time all season the Packers have had a fully healthy receiving core. I mean, obviously Watson's been back for a few weeks, but it was clear that it was Watson and Dobbs were the leaders in snaps, and Jayden Reed was he had 25 snaps, which was 47%. That's compared to 81% for Dobbs and 83% for Watson. Whereas Dontavian Wicks, the Thanksgiving star, he was essentially phased out with only 6 snaps, and Matthew Golden only had 5 snaps in his return. Both of those guys are very droppable at this point here. But yeah, Dobbs, I saw put up a goose egg for a lot of people. That was tough. And it was really, at the hands of Jayden Reed. He caught all 4 of his targets, got 2 carries for over 20 yards. So he's effective in the end arounds. And, that helps. You want to say Deebo Samuel type, but he's way higher, I think, in the weekly rankings here. Jayden Reed's the man to roster because his role, I think, is only going to grow. He's going to see more snaps, and he's going to continue to get plays that are designed for him. And I think he makes a perfectly fine flex option here as we get moving. Now, the Packers, I believe, have Denver this week, so that's a tough matchup for any fantasy situation here. Denver, but I mean, compared to other ones, Denver's 9 against opposing receivers in PPR formats. But looking at the rest of the year, he's got another matchup against the Bears, and then he's got the Ravens in fantasy championship week, who we thought the Ravens were turning a corner. It didn't quite look that way on Sunday. I'm all in trying to grab some Jayden Reed because you actually might it's tough because the availability isn't there, but I'd feel far more confident starting someone like Reed than I would even Corum or Wright because they're
Yes.
situational based. Like the PPR floor is higher than Reed. He'll get you more points in your lineup.
Yep, I agree with you. Packers rest of the season schedule, one of the most difficult in the league, and three of them, the final four at different venues. So they'll have the Broncos in Denver this week. They go to Soldier Field the following week. Then their final home game against the Ravens. Then finish the season against the Vikings. I know the Vikings are competitive against the Commanders. It's still, you'd assume that'd be a winnable game, but I would imagine a lot of people aren't playing Week 18 players anyhow. So the concept of Jayden Reed against the Broncos and Bears for your fantasy playoff lives is a difficult proposition for me. And I guess the Ravens to kind of cap things off in the championship. But he's an explosive player in an offense that is reliant on explosive plays and use Jayden Reed to unlock that. So somebody in the chat was asking, like, do I drop Romeo Doubs for some of these people? Unequivocally now with Reed back, I think the answer is yes. There might be games where Doubs ends up being better, but I think Reed, like you have on your list, is a little bit lower on this group because I'm not entirely certain when you're using Reed relative to these running backs. And it probably is dependent on how people are viewing the situation overall.
Yeah. And I'm just saying, like, I found myself throwing out John Mechie and Isaac Tesla, even with Amon-Ra, healthy on Thursday night. I would kill for Reed in those leagues. I wish I would have hung on to him because that's a far better option than those guys. And we'll get to a lot of quick hitter wide receivers at some point to help fill your lineups, but I think Reed is the guy.
While we're doing IR mentions, just a reminder that Mike Evans is potentially returning for the Buccaneers. I'd imagine he's well over that threshold, but same sort of concept. And I do believe that Trey Benson not being active on Friday of last week means he is done for the season. He's surpassed that 21-day activation window, although I believe the Cardinals might have still till today as we're recording this podcast.
Yeah, there's like a day or two in there, but he's very close to ending up on the drop list. Yep.
Yeah. And then the other one that, again, trying to put Jake's feet to the fire with the list and not really helping the majority of leagues is Harold Fannin, who, again, we talked about last week, has a nuclear game, which I have been playing Harold Fannin in Stake League for the last 10 weeks now. I think he's that kind of tight end. I have no idea how he is under 40% rostered, but Harold Fannin is a really good player, really good after the catch, and really big factor of that offense. You're going to talk about, Jake, how David Njoku being out makes a difference. I'm telling you, I don't think that was a big catalyst for it. This is just kind of a weird game whatsoever, but Njoku being out probably does make a slight uptick for at least the safer floor volume plays for Harold Fannin.
Yeah, that's part of how I rationalized putting Fannin in our top 5, despite him being 40% rostered, knowing I would get a little flack from you for that. But there is new news. There's a change in circumstances. Fannin was surpassing Njoku in terms of snaps and routes run and all that. The trend has been building for a couple of weeks. But, of course, Njoku left with a knee injury. He was ruled out for the game. We'll see what happens. Fannin ends up getting 11 targets, catches 8 of them for 114 and a score. He's been hovering around 40% for a few weeks in a row. This is it. This will be the last week you can go and get him. This will probably be the last week we can talk about him being under our threshold. And he has been, the Browns have been all over the place at quarterback this year. And he's been the one pretty steady factor in that whole situation here. So I don't want to say quarterback proof because, again, we're talking about Shadir Sanders and previously Dylan Gabriel, but he's still producing, and he is not just tight end one in that offense. He is wide receiver one in that offense. There are no other pass catchers that are doing what Fannin is. And yeah, bad offense, bad team, but he is someone you could comfortably start as your tight end. I was lucky to get Kincaid back. I've been struggling to replace Laporta in a couple of leagues. He's a comfortable start, I believe. Fannin is. So he made my top 5 because he's definitely under that threshold, but not for long.
Final player on this list, thankfully, should be available for everyone. And while I enjoyed watching my Packers beat the Bears, it was a very frustrating fantasy week for me. Thankfully, maybe a little bit less because I don't know what the status of Ceedee Lamb is going to be. And he'd been relevant to my teams if they were to have some good fortune go their way this past Sunday. It did not. And Lamb potentially being out could be a factor. Now, positives in the way of Ceedee Lamb is that he'll have the full 10 days to go ahead and recover from this. We did see the fencing, I think, that happened when that injury occurred, which I think I saw some neurological people that are in the fantasy community say it doesn't really mean that it's a more severe sort of concussion, which I guess I thought was different, but that's fine. If Ceedee Lamb is out, we have watched Ryan Flournoy in various different moments become a wide receiver 3. I don't think it's a Michael Wilson sort of situation like Marvin Harrison out with the Cardinals, but Ryan Flournoy, I was pretty impressed with what he played like even that loss to the Lions on last Thursday.
Yeah, and going back to Lamb, it says they're saying he's doing good, progressing nicely. I mean, all that's very generic kind of coach speak stuff. Doesn't really mean anything until we get an actual practice report or news that he's been clear. But Ryan Flournoy did warrant a spot in the top 5 here because he was effective. I mean, no doubt about it. He had a career day, caught 9 of his 13 targets for 115 and a score. He's really purely a play, though, if Ceedee Lamb doesn't get cleared, and it's a short-term thing. That's why he was further down on the list. Going back to weeks 4, 5, and 6, when the Cowboys played without Ceedee Lamb, Flournoy had 4.6, 18.4, and 6.4 fantasy points against defenses that were ranked 12th, 11th, and 8th against opposing wide receivers here. And funny enough here, the Cowboys have the top 2 defenses against opposing wide receivers coming up in Minnesota and the Chargers here. So part of me wants to say, listen, the Flournoy bump is maybe a little bit limited to Thursday Night Football, in which they kind of had to adjust on the fly, because it was really Jake Ferguson who's been getting the biggest bump in terms of Cowboys pass catchers when Ceedee Lamb sits. But Flournoy absolutely separates himself and gets into this conversation, without a doubt for me. And if Lamb is out, I could see wide receiver 3 range for him.
There you go. So that's our top 5 list, and I think unfortunately it pretty much is that top 5 from a standard perspective, like not standard leagues, but just that's what you should be looking at across the board. We'll go position by position here and just kind of update people on what that would look like. Again, for a lot of folks, me and a lot of my leagues, raising hands, the league is effectively done. So for maybe half the league at the postseason aspirations here next week or this week, we'll see if we can get you set from a streaming perspective on a few of those. And we'll get to the quarterbacks here in just a second. Let's get a word from our sponsors first, Prosper Trading. Every weekend, millions are bet on sports, hoping to beat the odds. But here's the truth. The house always wins. With trading, you're not betting, you're building. At Prosper Trading Academy, we give you tools, the education, and the live guidance to actually create an edge. You can control your risk, compound your wins, and trade alongside real pros every single day. Stop gambling on games you can't control. Start trading the markets you can. Visit prospertrading.com/ROTO today and take your shot at real financial growth. All right, the quarterback streamers. In my article, I'll be posted probably later today on the RotoWire site. It was basically CJ Stroud, who, again, we talked about last week. And then I think I ended up going with Bryce Young. You have a different quarterback in mind on top of your quarterback streaming list. I'm very curious just to debate the merits of these 3: Stroud, Bryce Young, and then the guy that you're interested in this week.
Yeah. Now, I bolded him because I wanted to discuss him. I don't think that, and the answer to your question, we'll take the lid off. I mentioned JJ McCarthy as an interesting streaming option because he and the Vikings offense played well, and the Cowboys defense continues to be dreadful, giving up tons and tons of points. And I think McCarthy has as good of a chance to get 20 fantasy points as any of these other guys. But I do still put Bryce Young a little higher on the list. I like him because now we mentioned him last week, knowing that he was going into a bye, and he got down to 17% owned during his bye week. There are some legitimate quarterbacks that need to be replaced this week, namely Daniel Jones. And, of course, recording on Monday, we'll see what goes on with Justin Herbert tonight. But Bryce Young is interesting because he had 34.4, 14, and 24.6 fantasy points in his last 3 weeks. The Saints are actually a top 10 defense against opposing quarterbacks, but I think that's a little misleading because generally they're more behind in games and teams lean on the run in the second half. But if that game's competitive and high scoring, Bryce Young is set up again. Then in the fantasy semifinals, he gets Tampa Bay, who's 30th against opposing quarterbacks. So Bryce Young for me, right up there with CJ Stroud here as my top 2 Daniel Jones replacement options here. I just threw JJ McCarthy in bold on our outline that we do because he is another one that was probably dropped in even super flex leagues, but I could see him taking a QB2 spot after looking passable against the Commanders and getting an even worse defense in week 15 here. So McCarthy's on the radar, at least for me.
Yeah, this is a good point. Would you rather have JJ McCarthy or Bryce Young in a must-start quarterback spot? 2 QBs, whatever, low-end quarterback, 1 streamer. I think, I wrote my article that you have a better chance at betting on 0-0 than on the roulette table, as opposed to assuming Bryce Young will actually do well. But 2 of the past 3 games, over 20 fantasy points. Obviously, it goes nuclear, before the bye. I just don't know how I feel about this.
You think he's rested and prepared. You've got that factor.
Divisional game, though, and that's what makes me a little bit nervous. And I think you can game plan for the Cowboys defense just fine. I don't know. Boy, this is I don't I put in the article. I don't want to be in a spot where I'm relying on either one of them. I almost like would say, is Tyler Shuck an option as well too? Like with the rushing floor that Shuck's been giving in the past couple weeks, it's gross. And unfortunately for the Colts, certainly in Colts fans, but I think anyone who is relying on Daniel Jones in fantasy, this is a really gross spot to be entering, likely the first week of the fantasy playoffs for a lot of people. So it's frustrating.
Yeah.
I think
Relying on Daniel Jones Daniel Jones was putting up solid fantasy numbers. He was a solid fantasy starter, but relying on him, I guess that conversation mostly applies to 2 quarterback leagues. And again, like I said, you probably saw JJ McCarthy dropped in some 2 quarterback leagues with how not great he had been looking.
So I know the chat will make us discuss Shedeur Sanders because they love to get back at Joe Bartel and laugh at him when he says Shedeur Sanders is not that guy. Jake, you also like to do that too. You were the one that was taking Shedeur Sanders and Scott Fishbowl and everything else. So how do you react to the? I was not able to watch the game. I just see the box score. Absolutely insane numbers. What are your thoughts on Shedeur Sanders this week at Soldier Field against the Bears in a must-win game for Chicago?
I don't love it. I mean, there's a reason I didn't really highlight him. Yeah, he had a good game. I certainly can't take that away from him. He's the starter rest of the season. That's officially been announced. Good to go. You're going to see what you have in him. At Chicago, who's 29th against opposing quarterbacks, and then gets a tougher matchup against the Bills, then another good one against the Steelers, who's 27. If you're playing week 18, he gets the Bengals, who's 31. So it's a nice rest of season schedule. I don't know how long this offense can exist relying on Judkins and force feeding the tight end to move the ball. Shedeur Sanders is interesting, but there's a reason he's below that tier of names. I'm not going to start him over Bryce Young, not going to start him over JJ McCarthy this week. Certainly not going to start him even over. I'd probably play Aaron Rodgers again, home against Miami, even Tua at Pittsburgh if the weather's somewhat decent there. Definitely not going to play him over CJ Stroud. So I think if you're at the point where you're considering it, there are 3 or 4 other names that you probably push ahead.
You're maybe at the Shedeur Sanders range when we're discussing the 2 quarterbacks, and that was aided by Jaden Daniels predictably getting injured. I would imagine now at this point, even if he was told that he was fine to return if the game was more competitive, this would be stupid for the Commanders to go ahead and play him, given he's had multiple elbow injuries to a severity degree over the past month. So Marcus Mariota against the Giants this week. I mean, I don't mind that. If you're kind of in the business of looking at 2 quarterbacks, he's in that mix along with the Geno Smith Raiders benching and whatever's happening with the Jets as well too.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, Shedeur definitely comes up ahead of Riley Leonard, who's going to take over for the Colts. I actually needed a reminder that Anthony Richardson's been on IR after undergoing surgery to repair a fractured orbital. So Riley Leonard is the guy for Indy. He went 18 for 29 for 145 yards, no touchdowns, and a pick. Also got a rushing TD. I put Shedeur ahead of him pretty clearly. Obviously, Geno Smith injured his hand. I saw him on the bench. He didn't have great body language. I don't know. That's a weird situation there. Kenny Pickett enters the game. We'll see how that goes. But Shedeur over Kenny Pickett. Then obviously you got the Jets situation. Tyrod Taylor left with the groin injury. In comes Brady Cook, the rookie undrafted free agent out of Missouri. In relief of Tyrod Taylor, he was 14 for 30, 163 yards and 2 interceptions. I believe the only touchdown the Jets scored was on special teams there, so it's not like he was leading drives either. Obviously, all those guys are way down the list. I mean, you can't. There will be somebody better than them, even in super flex leagues. I'd start a wide receiver over Brady Cook or Kenny Pickett or Riley Leonard.
Yeah, there was one league where I played Tyrod over Justin Herbert. I don't know if I would have made the fantasy playoffs anyway, but getting a good old negative points as opposed to just say 20 certainly didn't help. There's another league where I'm preparing for fantasy postseason. I picked up Tyrod Taylor as my quarterback 3 in a league that really has very few options, so I can't really go down that direction anymore. Hope Lamar Jackson and Dak stay healthy and actually play well. Who knows about that? I mean, it's frustrating. It's frustrating and brutal right now with the situation that's happening at the quarterback position and Daniel Jones' injury, especially again for Colts fans. Very, very tough spot overall because I think you're looking down the barrel of missing the postseason entirely. Anthony Richardson will not be activated off of injury reserve this week. He could potentially in 2 weeks, but we don't know yet. I think I saw a report from one of the Colts beat reporters that suggests they have seen Anthony Richardson recently, not anywhere close to being active, which would tell me that there's a lot of swelling with the orbital bone fracture and maybe other stuff going on as well too.
Put a helmet on.
I mean, that's literally, yeah. As you and I who have played very, not like competitive level football. We played football though. Yes, that would actually legitimately hurt, especially if you have a fracture there. So, very
An
frustrating
MMA
spot.
injury. I see the fractured orbital all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now you're just flexing on us, Jake. Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a break and come back here with the running backs in just a second. A word from our sponsors, Dabble. Dabble isn't just another DFS app. It's the ultimate social platform where you can connect with other fantasy sports lovers. Dabble lets you win big because you can win up to 5,000 times your money this football season. Starting with Dabble, it's pretty darn easy. New users get $25 free when signing up. No deposit necessary. Check out the link in the episode description below to download Dabble right now. At least the running backs that I had written up for this article, again, published probably in the site a little bit later today. We mentioned Jaylen Wright, Blake Corum at the very top. I think it's fine if we want to go over them once again, but they are in some form or fashion the top waiver options for us this week too. And then probably, depending on the stats of Tyrone Tracy of the Giants, Devin Singletary becomes in that mix as well among those top three guys.
Yeah, Singletary, like those two. The thing that they all have in common, maybe a little bit less so, right, was standalone value as a possible play and somewhat of a 5-6 point PPR floor. But everything changed for Jaylen Wright because of the possible hand injury. We'll watch the practice report this week. Everything changed for Blake Corum because he just made the most of his touches this week. He is RB2 in terms of snap count, but he's really making the most of his time on the field here. The other names I wanted to mention, guys you don't really get excited about, but just reminders. I threw Bam Knight on here. He's only 38% rostered. It's starting to seem like Trey Benson won't play the rest of the season. It's Monday afternoon. We're recording. We're awaiting official confirmation on that. I think we should know tomorrow or Tuesday. But Bam Knight, I guess, is RB1 in Arizona by default. If there's no Trey Benson returning, he'll probably be on my drop list. Benson, that is this week.
Yeah, me too.
Chris Rodriguez, again, it's not super encouraging there with the Commanders' offense as a whole, but Chris Rodriguez is RB1 in Washington. Krosky Merritt was a little more involved, carrying the ball 7 times for 32 yards. Chris Rodriguez carried the ball 10 times for 52 yards, and that's against a pretty tough Vikings defense there. Jeremy McNichols was pretty much disappeared, only had 1 catch on 1 target there. But Chris Rodriguez is the lead back there, and there is some value in that out of desperation, I guess. I wanted to mention that Tyler Algier is only 41% rostered. He got double-digit touches this week. He continues to steal carries and goal line touches from Bijan Robinson, so that makes him somewhat interesting as standalone value here, maybe a little bit more than the regular handcuff. And if you really, really, really want to stretch, I wanted to note that Dylan Sampson had a 49% route.
I don't mind this one. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And he actually caught 5 of 6 targets for 64 yards, which is, he only carried the ball twice for 4 yards, but his 38% snap share was his highest since week 8. Clearly, Shedeur Sanders is not throwing down the field to his receivers. He's looking for his tight ends and his backs, and Sampson fits that pass catching back mold. So there's some utility there. Again,
if the offense becomes elevated, if you're the person that thinks Shedeur Sanders makes the Browns offense elevated, that by default makes Judkins better, it makes Jerry Jeudy better, but it would make a Dylan Sampson become having some utility in the same way we discussed Tajay Spears a decent amount, at least we did earlier this season. Dylan Sampson has that role within the offense, but I think that's the sort of functional capability I'm assuming would end up happening. So I like that one in super deep formats. I'd imagine Dylan Sampson was a popular pickup in August because there's an assumption he would be the starting running back for the Browns in the event Judkins is suspended. There's been some fade, like we always talk about star leagues, specifically in Yahoo leagues, the ones are active right now. I bet you Dylan Sampson's a little bit lower on those ones too, and I think he has been involved enough. If you think Shedeur Sanders continues to elevate this offense better than Dylan Gabriel is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, well said. That's pretty much my list for running backs. I didn't have much for drops. Obviously, Krosky Merritt's still on my drop list. I think Emmanuel Wilson, if you're not a Josh Jacobs owner, would be a fine drop for any of these because, the carries that were seemingly going to Wilson before as a change of pace from Jacobs were pretty much going to Jayden Reed this week. So he goes on the drop list. And yeah, that's the only 2 names that came to mind here. You mentioned Tajay Spears, Titans leading receiver, Tajay Spears.
God, I didn't realize that. I think I ended up playing
with 28 yards. So it's that was.
I think I played Tajay Spears because I've been doing the Chuba Hubbard thing. It doesn't matter anyway. I'm completely out of in stake league. I know you are trying to fight your way back. Keep on just grinding a little bit more week by week. We have a few more weeks of the entire regular season to get to that point. But yeah, it's
I'm over 100 this week with AJ Brown and Ladd McConkey both going tonight. So it could be another big week if those guys show up.
There you go. All right, let's get to the receivers and again a bit more depth to this with the idea that Jayden Reed possibly he's available in shallower leagues, but there is a few deeper options here too. And before we do so, let's get a word from our sponsors, Blue Wire. Okay, we're back again talking receivers. Jayden Reed was among that list if you are in shallow leagues, but whether it be Ryan Flournoy or again Luther Burden, he has made my article 3 the past 4 weeks, still only at 17% rostered. And Roma Dunze was listed as week to week, didn't play against the Packers this week. I thought Luther Burden looked good outside of times where he was clearly instigating fights that Keyshawn Nixon gets penalized for. That was we're on a network that we can't say swear words. So that was baloney, Jake, that Keyshawn Nixon gets choked out and gets a 15-yard penalty. That was in my end zone. I was watching Luther Burden hit 3 other people before Nixon gets that 15-yard penalty. So NFL, get your stuff together, please, because that was incredibly embarrassing to go ahead and watch happen. I literally watched Burden. You'll find cameras out there, punch 3 people in the face beforehand. So really cool that was a 15-yard penalty. Don't like that I have to roster Burden in fantasy because of that, but he might be an option with Roma Dunze possibly out again this week.
I'm sure Luther Burden's going to get a letter in the mail from the league this week with a certain amount of cash that he is going to owe them. So I feel like on replay that'll happen. But strictly from a fantasy value speaking, I feel like we had to include Burden. I didn't necessarily want to talk about him the 3rd week in a row. But again, the circumstances change. The last 2 weeks I was thinking maybe a $1 keeper flyer to see if he, it emerges over the end. Like he was trending up for several weeks, before the Roma Dunze injury. And Dunze has that foot injury. He was out Sunday. He's considered week to week. Weirdly enough, Zacchaeus still had more snaps than Luther Burden. He was out there for what do I have here? Zacchaeus 55 snaps, DJ Moore 58 snaps, Luther Burden 50 snaps. But the 50 snaps and the 71% snap share were a season high in both. He was making the most of his opportunities. His route participation was growing, trending up week to week. And then finally we saw him, really affect the way the offense runs. I mean, he led the way in targets with 6. He led the team in receiving yards with 67. Tied Colson Loveland for the team high in catches with 4. Now, he does have a pretty tough schedule upcoming. He's got the Browns, then the Packers again, and then at San Francisco. But San Francisco being the easiest matchup he faces on paper, that might be moot, assuming a Dunze returns. But yes, the circumstances have changed with Luther Burden. If a Dunze is out, I could very much see giving him a starting nod this week against the Browns, depending on, of course, your individual circumstances.
Yeah, it's I like the Bears offense is really good. And the way they've been setting up the play action, I think Luther Burden specifically could be involved in that. I was just really impressed with what Chicago was able to do, obviously in the win for the Packers, but that was a game that if it gets played 5 more minutes, I think the Packers end up losing. Like that was awesome offense, especially in the second half, and Burden being a factor for that, regardless of a Dunze. Now, again, I think you talked about this too, but just reiterating, the Browns are not a pushover defense. And while I thought that offensive line played very well, especially holding Micah Parsons as often as they did, you can also hold Myles Garrett the same way, and the NFL won't call that either. So I do think there's opportunities for the Bears offense to go ahead and do that effectively. And I like I like Luther Burden to a certain extent. Like it would be in the same sort of vein of playing Bryce Young if you had to hold your nose and dive in. But I do think Luther Burden has kind of a guaranteed 10-point floor if you have Roma Dunze unavailable for this one. So
want to do some quick hitters. I've just got a bunch of news and notes that
let's go for it. Yeah,
possible guys. I did want to mention Jaden Higgins, actually dangerously close to making my top 5 because he's only 42% rostered. Only caught 3 of 5 targets for 34 yards, which isn't much, but he's still wide receiver 2 on the Texans in terms of both targets and snap counts. And he's got decent matchups to finish the year, at least up in these next 2 weeks versus Arizona versus the Raiders. Then he's at the Chargers, probably sit him then. But Higgins is very much still on the radar. Kayshon Boutte down to 29% rostered during the bye. He's been getting steady volume all year for the Patriots and is a red zone option there. So you could probably do worse if you're looking for a flyer. There's a weird Colts situation with Alec Pierce where the broadcast said he was being evaluated for concussion. And then he actually talked to the media afterwards, which rules out a concussion because you can't talk to a player in concussion protocol. But he's dealing with some kind of undisclosed injury and basically said, ask the trainers. So I thought that was a little bit weird. But if anything happens with him, Josh Downs maybe gets a little bit of a bump. He had 5 targets here. Remember, this is Riley Leonard that's going to be playing for the Colts. So maybe nothing there. A little kick returner section. Chimere DK was back. Had 8 targets, caught 5 of them for 24 yards and a score. So he's there. He's a guy that's probably wrapped up in your return yard leagues, but offers a little value outside of that. And speaking of kick returners, Rashid Shaheed, I think 52% is over-owned for him probably. But if there are kick return leagues, he did return a kick in Sunday's route with the Falcons. Also caught 4 of 5 targets for 67 yards. So and was out there for 31 snaps, but he's still wide receiver 3. JSN had 44 snaps. Cooper Kupp had 42. So I just don't see wide receiver 3 giving a ton of value outside of kick return leagues. But I just wanted to note that. Back to the Jets, guys. You're looking at John Mechie at 9%, A.D. Mitchell at 26%. They're viable if Tyrod Taylor is okay. Don't love that, but they're out there. I think I actually like. I'm going to stick my flag in here. I like Mechie better than A.D. Mitchell rest of season here. I think it's a little more stability offered there.
If Fields plays, does that change your outcome, or is it just overall any other Jets quarterback besides Tyrod Taylor? You're like, I'm out on these Jets pass catchers.
Yeah, I mean, if Fields plays, then I'd bench them both for sure. I'd rather start someone like as Isaac Tisla at 12%. He's shaping into a touchdown-dependent option, but he does get those scores, especially while Khalif Raymond is out. Tesla probably needs an injury to be a safe starter. And then just noting, Gabe Davis led the Bills in routes run, only caught 2 passes for 21 yards. But, if you want to look at the back end and try to find some ceiling, there's that. Same thing with the Commanders. Noah Brown led them in routes run, but only caught 1 of his 2 targets for 19 yards. But just saying that there's some ceiling and room to grow there that you might not actually see just sifting through the regular box scores. But yeah, if it's Justin Fields, I'm definitely not trusting any of these guys. I haven't seen an update on Garrett Wilson lately either. Obviously, that could change things too, and send the 6 targets that are going to go to a wide receiver will probably get force fed to Wilson over those guys. He's still very much TBD. He's eligible to come off IR this week, but apparently there's a medical decision that needs to be made according to Aaron Glenn, which doesn't sound great.
Medical decision being we stink, and it probably doesn't give it best interest to bring back Garrison.
They're fully in that hunt for the first overall pick here. Why bring him back?
It's annoying that we have to deal with that in fantasy, especially when it comes to a top player. But I don't know if Fields is the quarterback for the Jets, even for 1 week, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm dropping everybody. A.D. Mechie doesn't need to be my roster whatsoever. Yes, I'm a little bit concerned because I was kind of getting some optimism with the Jets offense and how it was improving with Tyrod Taylor. Well, of course, that completely blew up in smoke right away. The second I had to play Tyrod Taylor in a critical league. Am I bitter, Jake? Yes, you bet I am bitter. This is a bitter Joe Bartel today for sure, with a few of the fantasy things that happened. Let's move over to the tight end position again. Harold Fannin made the top of our list. We had discussed him last week as well too. Only rose 7% in fantasy leagues, which I thought was moronic at the time that he was available, and certainly appears to be after now a monster game. You talked about no Dave Njoku. Maybe is that the catalyst for why Fannin ends up going well? I don't think we'll ever figure that sort of situation out, but for Harold Fannin on the top of our top 5 waiver list, and certainly among tight ends this week.
Yeah, Harold Fannin, clear cut number 1, and one of your priority ads just overall. Make sure that nobody else gets Harold Fannin and starts him against you. Another name that we've brought up quite a bit of times this year, especially recently, is Colston Loveland. He's at 40% rostered, averaging 13.3 PPR points per game over the last 6 weeks. Has never been below 5.8 PPR points during that stretch. That's a very manageable, from a tight end position there as the offense continues to develop and he gets more comfortable. So that's an option. I see Isaiah Likely mentioned out there a whole lot of times. Lamar threw 35 times, and the second most targets went to Likely, who caught 4 of 6 for 25 in his score. And I think there was a Mark Andrews contract extension in there this week too, but that'll be very variable from week to week. Have to mention Mike Gesicki, who caught all 6 of his targets for 86 in his score. That's 20.6 PPR points. Obviously, the ceiling raises with Joe Burrow around there. But his snap share is really, it's not any better than Noah Fant and Drew Samples. So you can expect volatile game logs there. We just talked about the Jets. Don't need to devote too much time to the Jets. Mason Taylor's 24% rostered. He got 8 targets this week. Again, it hasn't really led to much, any real big fantasy days, but I think I do believe that he's a player that's going to stick around in this league for quite some time and be effective at one point or another. Just the complete, ineptitude of the offense is limiting him. And then I do have to note Zach Ertz was carted off, torn ACL, feared. Benson Knott got the only tight end target, I believe, and Bates is the other guy on that depth chart who was really just a blocker, as far as I understand things. Not really rushing for Benson Knott, but I guess if you're looking deep, double PPR tight end leagues and that have 4 flexes, then maybe he gets a nod. But throwing it out there for completion's sake.
I thought it was Sinat, whatever. Yeah, Commander's tight end. I loved him a couple of years ago, and he really has not had the opportunity with Zach Ertz. We also had a bit of breaking news just now, Jake, that T. Higgins is in concussion protocol. Bengals star receiver. That's, of course, a second concussion is in as many, or I guess in 3 weeks. So I would assume T. Higgins, if he's not done for the foreseeable, if he's not done for this week, he might be done for the season. Given how
I think he's had concussions in the past too, right?
So let's do this, a bit of impromptu fantasy value with this. We're talking about near the end of the podcast. We're talking about the tight ends overall, but dating back now with T. Higgins potentially done for the season. What does that mean for Yoshi Voss? And then what does that mean for Mitchell Tinsley as well, too, from a fantasy perspective, among the other receivers that were out there, like Ryan Flournoy, Jayden Reed, for example?
Yeah, Yoshi Voss is, I guess he would crack the top 5 if we know Ceedee Lamb is healthy. Otherwise, I wouldn't put him ahead of Flournoy or Jayden Reed. Yoshi Voss is interesting, but that's about it. I would probably rank him ahead of Luther Burden confidently, especially if Odunes is back. It's really hard to rank these guys on Monday afternoon when we have no practice reports yet. But he's definitely in the mix, and that raises the ceiling for Gesicki a little bit too. If you need a home run play, maybe you throw him out there, and maybe you can get a couple of catches in the red zone.
I think I would have Yoshi Voss maybe as my number 2 pickup. I'm looking at this rest of season schedule here. The Ravens week 15. You could realistically in like a 12-team league play Yoshi Voss as a wide receiver 2. I'm sorry, as a flex, not as a wide receiver 3, as a flex. Dolphins, which is like on the metrics, good against opposing passing offenses. That's because you could run against them earlier this year. I think they're certainly susceptible, at least when a quarterback of Joe Burrow's caliber. And then you end the fantasy postseason likely in week 17 against the Cardinals, another defense that has a lot of passing options. I think Yoshi Voss actually is right up there for me. And I like Mitchell Tinsley as a prospect too. I think he has a lot of explosiveness as a pass catcher. I like Tinsley a little bit in deeper formats. So again, T. Higgins in concussion protocol, his second one in the past 3 weeks. Pretty typically, that means you're at minimum out this week, if not longer. Think sort of back to the Chris Olave scenario, which had a longer duration between the first concussion and the second concussion last year. So unfortunate spot if you need Higgins at all, like I do in the Dynasty League to make it through the consolation bracket and get a high pick. So that's cool. Love that.
Yep. Moving on. I got some defenses here. I don't have any other. You nailed the Yoshi Voss analysis, and let me
be the grumpy guy. That's all I need, Jake. That's fine. No, go ahead. Go to your streaming defenses here as we round out the end of the show.
All right. So you have to ask yourself the question here. No teams are on bye for the rest of the season. Is there anybody worth picking up more than who you already have? Or is there anyone worth benching in a really tough matchup? And the one that comes to mind is, do you bench the Broncos this week against the Packers? I'd probably lean no. I'd still roll them out there. They've been good all year. And, of course, this game is, in Denver. So you keep them. But a couple other names you might want to look at if you have been streaming and need another option. The Patriots were the number 6 highest scoring fantasy defense in the league, and they got down to 48% rostered during their bye week. So they're interesting. Now they have the Bills this week. Not a good matchup on paper, but they're at Baltimore in week 16 and at the Giants in this fantasy championship. So it's a pretty good rest of season schedule here for the Patriots, and they are scoring and almost matchup proof to begin with. So they're one that you consider. If you're looking at week specific matchups, I think Jacksonville is the top one to look at. They've already been pretty good at creating turnovers. They're down at 36% rostered. They're home and they're playing the Jets, and the Jets are terrible. And if it ends up being Brady Cook, then maybe I could see starting the Jags over a defense like Denver, even over one of the top ones in the league.
You're playing the Jags over Denver for sure.
That matchup looks like. So definitely looking at them. And then a couple other, I guess, in consideration here. San Francisco, 24% home against Tennessee. That'll probably be a pretty low over-under game. Chicago, 22% home against Cleveland. I think that's a pretty good matchup as well here. But the Jags could be the clear-cut option, even if Tyrod Taylor starts. I do like the Jags getting a couple of takeaways and controlling the tempo of that game here, and mentioning New England as far as looking ahead. I'm not at the point quite where I'm looking super ahead to the fantasy championships and stashing a second defense, because a lot can change week to week. But the Patriots were the one that I wanted to note because their rostership fell below our threshold while they were on a bye.
Not that it already wasn't present. The Seahawks being the top fantasy defense this year, and certainly over the past month, they would get the Colts and Leonard or whatever quarterback is thrown out there. So Seahawks are very comfortably the very top option as well too. I think the Jags would be number 2. I was trying to look up like what degree of confidence do I have with whatever quarterback backup might be if Fields and Tyrod Taylor are out, and even if Tyrod Taylor's out and Fields available, I would still play Jacksonville's defense as the top 5 because that offense has been horrific.
I mean,
if it's been
I'd play Philly against the Raiders.
Over the Jags? No, I'll take the Jags. I'll take the Jags.
Home against the Raiders, I think Philly is the one I'd prefer there. But yeah, again, it gets top 5, especially if it's Cook.
Yeah, I was trying. Somebody in the chat mentioned the Pats defense. I guess I don't know what their Week 16 schedule is, although I know their entire schedule.
The Pats were they have the Bills.
Yes,
48%. So it's a tough matchup, but they have a good rest of the season schedule that could get interesting.
Goodness, yeah. Yeah, okay. All right, well, that does it for us on the Monday edition of the Waiver podcast here. Again, we'll be having the article up on the site. It's free to read, no paywall necessary. We'll do updates throughout the rest of the week as well, too, although you guys have probably listened to a handful of ones that I've already talked about. We'll get more injury news and information probably on Trey Benson earlier, I guess, later in the evening. But otherwise, a lot of these guys, and I think especially Justin Herbert's stats as we record this early Monday, we'll have to kind of see what ends up happening here with that, but we'll get a lot more injury updates over the next 24 hours, 48 hours. Hopefully, best of luck to everyone who had made the fantasy playoffs. Let's go ahead and see you guys all in the chat next week because we're talking about fantasy glory here in a little bit, but otherwise, for Jake and Joe, this is the sign off here for the Week 15 Waiver Wire podcast. Thank you all.